If you're enjoying this podcast or any podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon shop. You can tout your podcast pride while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. Make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com. Get your dragon swag on.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation, to another fabulous episode of your favorite Shakespeare Mystery Exploration podcast. I have with me today a very special guest from way down under, all the way on the other side of the world. His name is Michael Curtati, and he is a practicing lawyer who happens to work at the National University of Australia, where he is joining us from today. The reason he's here today is because he is a student of Shakespeare, and most importantly, as an Italian Australian, he is a student of the Italian source materials that we know contributed to Shakespeare's muse and the writing of several of those works. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen. It's an absolute delight to be here with you today, and a real privilege. I've listened to many of your episodes, and I know you've had some fantastic guests on this show. So thank you very much for inviting me. I hope it'll be a fun session for all the listeners.
If you've been listening, Michael, then you know that I tend to be someone who has repeatedly said that I think the only way we can truly get to the bottom of the Shakespeare authorship mystery is by understanding that the author had to have been capable of reading, writing, understanding, probably fluently speaking multiple languages, of course, Italian being one of the most prominent and prevalent of those languages. And so I was really thrilled when you reached out to me, because you're the type of expert that I've been looking to find when it comes to helping us understand the Italian source works that Shakespeare drew upon for his writings, and how that connects to those writings in a way that perhaps only someone like yourself, who is also so fluent in that language, could probably explain to us better than those of us who are only English speakers.
Yeah, I'd heard you make that call out on your show, and I thought it was a very insightful call out, and it absolutely spoke to me. I thought I should reach out and, we could have this conversation. But I should say I'm not an expert. I'm very much an amateur. This is a kind of passion project for me. As you've mentioned, I'm a lawyer in my day job. I work at a community legal centre on the Australian National University campus. We do community legal service for students. But in my spare time, I love to explore Italian history, culture, literature. And as part of that journey, I've been drawn to discover, I guess, the connections with Shakespeare. And I'm really fascinated by how England in that period, in the Renaissance period, is connected with Italy, and how these stories travelled across those international boundaries. In fact, Italy, of course, didn't exist at that time. So, yeah, it's a really fascinating story.
Well, let's dive right in, because one of the most exciting things about this episode, and I want to make sure that we share and we'll mention it repeatedly throughout, is you've just recently published a new book. And in addition to your scholarship in the area of Shakespeare and in the area of source works for Shakespeare, you're also a writer in I don't know how you have as much spare time as you do, but you're also a writer, and you've published a new book, and it's a very exciting book for me. And I can't wait to get the side-by-side copy. I know you have it in a couple of different versions, but why don't you share with the listening audience a little bit about this latest book and how that connects to some of your other work?
Sure. So I've been writing generally about Italian culture and literature, but the first kind of Shakespearean-related translation I've done is Romeo and Juliet, which is a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story in Shakespeare's version. It's a beautiful story in the Italian version. And the Italian version that I translated was a version by Matteo Bandello, which was the version which made it out of Italy, got translated into French, then English, and eventually shows up in the play. So, yeah, I guess the spark for that was my wife and I were traveling to Italy. We'd never been to Verona, and we decided that we wanted to visit the city. And on the way over, the flight had Shakespeare in Love as one of the choices. And I thought, oh, why don't I rewatch it? Be great sort of lead into Verona. But watching that movie, it was kind of, while I love the movie, it's great art in its own right. A wonderful kind of reimagining of the play and other Shakespeare plays. But it's entirely mythical, as you know. The history is completely different. And, as I was watching it at this stage, I knew about Matteo Bandello. And then I really felt this urge to want to make the version that he wrote better known. So what I've tried to create is an accessible English translation, hopefully a fun English translation that people can just pick up and read and enjoy the story in its Italian version. But of course, that journey, led to a whole lot of other kind of insights and discoveries and lots of fun on the way.
Well, I have to, but before we dive into some of those, I have to ask you, because it just popped into my head, and I'm curious, when you and your wife are on a plane together and you decide you're going to watch the same movie, do you do what my wife and I do, which is we get to the movie, we push play on the little screen in front of us in our individual chairs right at the exact same time, so that we can be listening and watching on our own screen simultaneously, so that way we're not laughing out of sync or having reactions out of sync in the movie? Do you try to coordinate that? Do you do that?
I haven't, but it sounds like a great idea. Yeah, perhaps on our next flight, we'll try to do something like that.
It's sort of like a watch along, which we also have one of those in our bonus library that we offer to listeners that they can tap into, and they can watch anonymous along with our commentary. But one of the trickiest parts is pushing play right at the exact same moment. That's the crucial part to it.
Yep.
So Bandello, why did you begin with Romeo and Juliet? Was that the first endeavor of this sort of, I'm going to take these Italian novellas and do a new English translation of them? And how much of the Shakespeare connection did you have in mind while doing your translations and while working on the piece?
Yeah, so this one was the first Shakespeare-related translation I've done. I've done another translation of another Italian novella, but it's 19th century, not related to Shakespeare. But this one was the first one, and really from that catalyst, and then it's kind of led me into others. I've got about 4 or 5 pieces of unfinished work, or Othello, or maybe Much Ado About Nothing. Some of the source stories for those might be the next ones that I'm hoping to publish. But this one really from that, the movie was actually the lead in. So it's kind of, it was great that I watched it. It inspired me to start exploring this. And, the more I read into the story, the more I became fascinated by how close England and Italy were in that period, how Shakespeare, takes things and puts them on stage, and also how he reworks things. And yeah, I'll use the word Shakespeare here. I know you've talked about the Shakespeare, but yeah, so just for convenience, I'll use that term.
Of course. And I think, most of our listeners, no matter whether they have recently joined the Quiller Nation or have been with us for the 5 full years of our existence, most of them understand that when we talk about these terms, it would just eat up so much time to have to keep clarifying who we're talking about. Yeah. And I think in most conversations, what we're always talking about is the man who wrote the works, regardless of who you believe that man is. The name that is on the works is Shakespeare, and someone is behind that name. And it doesn't matter whether it's the orthodoxy version of Stratford, or it's the Oxfordian version, or the Marlovians, or the Baconians, or the Rutlandians. The bottom line is, whatever, when we talk about Shakespeare, we're talking about the author. And in your case, I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and at least, add some highlights on top of this, what you found was an author who was in some way, in my opinion, a great way, inspired by Bandello. And as you mentioned, not just with Romeo and Juliet, but I believe Bandello is also the inspiration, as you mentioned, Much Ado About Nothing. So Bandello was a pretty prolific writer then, wasn't he?
Yeah, he wrote 200 novellas, and 3 or 4 of them make their way into Shakespeare plays. So there's Cymbeline, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night. They all have sources that you can find in Bandello. Although, always the source history is a little bit more complicated. But something I should say is, I'm not in kind of showcasing these Italian sources. I'm not at all trying to take anything away from Shakespeare. Sometimes there's that anxiety that some people have. In fact, for me, knowing about these stories makes it so much richer. So to kind of capture the difference that we understand when we look at these stories, if you look at the way that Shakespeare in Love, its byline, the way it's built, it runs like this. The world's greatest ever playwright, William Shakespeare, is young, out of ideas and short on cash, but meets his ideal in woman and is inspired to write one of his most famous plays. Okay, so it's all about how, these things all happen in the life of William Shakespeare through his experience in London. But, what the story leaves out is the stories he read. In that sense, they did happen in his life, but they happened through these stories. He found stories. He loved them. He thought they were great. He wanted to make them better and put them on stage. So, I think that's really what, looking at these Italian novellas and other sources gives us.
Well, it's
one
obvious
way
that it's hard to say.
Tried to think about it is that.
Sorry, one of the things about the delay is we end up talking over each other a couple of times.
No, go ahead.
But what I was going to say is, it's of course really difficult to figure which of the Bandello novellas inspired which work first. But what we can say is that obviously there was one that led to another, that led to another, that led to another. And you almost have to wonder if the author of the plays experienced them as a set, like, he received a collection of Bandello novellas, or he read one and then went and sought out others. That would be part of the mystery for me, is to, how did his introduction to Bandello occur, and in what way, and then why did he find this, I'd call it an infatuation with the works of this particular writer?
Yeah. Well, on the last point, I think because Bandello's a really good writer, he's just an entertaining raconteur. You read his stories and you enjoy reading them. So, there's a number of possibilities as to how Shakespeare may have, first experienced the works. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, and I think this was sort of canvassed in your interview with Catherine Chillian, if I've got that right. She notes that Arthur Brooke had done a translation of Romeo and Juliet out of the French version. He's got this poetic version, which the general consensus seems to be isn't very good. But when he wrote his story in 1562, which is quite early, he also mentions at the beginning that he saw the play, presumably in England, maybe at Inns of Court where he was. And so already that story was there. So maybe the French translations were already in England. Maybe Bandello's book was already in England. And certainly later on, there were other translations that appeared. There's one by William Painter that has a number of the Bandello works. So yeah, it's hard to really pin it down. In looking at the text, working on the text, as you're doing translation, you get quite close to it. You kind of notice things, and there are a few places where I thought this has to come from a reading of the Italian version, or it looks like it comes from a reading of the Italian version. It's a little bit tricky because you have to filter out everything that's in the French versions and the English version to be able to say, oh, that's where it came from. That's where Shakespeare saw that particular idea.
Well, that's an incredible point because, as you mentioned, you're talking, Brooke's version is so early. And for Brooke to say that he saw a stage version of it prior to him being inspired to translate it from Italian to French, would bespeak that there is this play that exists that's out there that had to have been rooted in the Italian version, the original Italian Bandello version. And so I'm curious to ask you, and I can't even imagine how much brain power it takes to read something in a foreign language and translate it into another language. I mean, you blow me away. Your brain power to be able to do something like that is astounding to me. But I'm so thrilled that we have smart guys like you who can do that kind of thing, because it gives us so much more insight into the ability to look at the Italian version and to determine whether the stage version we have took its influence from that original Italian, from the French, or from the later English translation. And what did you find? What do you think is the answer there?
Yeah, so and there is scholarship out there, and there's a lot of in English language scholarship around sources, which is worth digging up because there's often good insights in them. But what I kind of felt, and others have sort of reached this same conclusion, it's pretty clear he draws primarily from Arthur Brooke. And Arthur Brooke's version was into English, from French into English, just to clarify that. But it's not the whole story because, for example, one researcher looks at Shakespeare and Brooke and the other versions and says, well, it's pretty clear that Shakespeare could tell the bad stuff that Brooke had put in and leave it out. He left that stuff out. So, there's this kind of negative evidence that he was consulting these other versions. There's other sort of little clues, like Shakespeare uses the character Peter as a servant in the household of Juliet. That character only appears, so then, it gets pretty involved, but there were 3 Italian versions, but there was one preceding Bandello by a guy called Luigi da Porto, and he has this servant in the Capulet household, in Juliet's household, called Peter. So does Shakespeare. No other versions have that particular character. So, that sort of says, well, Shakespeare looks like Shakespeare read the da Porto version. And of course, these versions would have been floating around in England. It's not just, I think the question is broader than just what Shakespeare would have read. It's, what was in the libraries of, the aristocracy of England in that period. They loved all this stuff, of course. They were traveling to Italy. They were, acquiring Italian works. And, these works were available in England. In fact, if you search for Romeo or Romeus or Juliet or Juliet in early English books online, you find hits in the 1560s and 70s in particular. They were already in that era among the most famous lovers in the British canon. Of course, this is before the traditional date of the play. So the story was getting around in England. But to come back to, clues that Shakespeare read the Italian version, in my own kind of working on it, there's a couple of things that kind of jumped out at me. So one is in the scene where Mercutio and Tybalt are fighting, if you look at Quarto 1 of Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio sort of shouts this phrase, alla stoccata, which is an Italian fencing term. And that term, stoccata, that word, appears in the Italian, only in the Italian version of Bandello. And it appears at the same point in the plot, although in the Bandello version, Bandello's describing essentially Romeo stabbing Tybalt. So again, you're kind of suggesting, did Shakespeare read the Bandello's version? Why does he use the same word at the same point? There's another sort of interesting parallel in language. The name Benvolio is a little bit of a mystery. I haven't really found a good explanation of where it comes from. Obviously, one of the main characters in the play. But in Bandello, there's this word used for a person, a well-wisher, and the word is benvolente, which obviously, inspires the name Benvolio. And it's applied in the Bandello version to the person who tells Romeo that Juliet is a Capulet. But maybe that's the inspiration for Shakespeare for the character name.
A couple of things come to mind there in listening to you. A couple of things that just jumped into my head while you're explaining these things is the stoccata, for instance, is as you say, it's a fencing term, and it was the rapier and dagger form of combat that we still learn today. Those of us who are involved in Shakespeare companies, because there are so many sword fights, especially in that play, particularly. And the actors need to learn their proper fencing in order to play those scenes off appropriately and to learn their fight choreography. And that would have been something that only a swordsman would have been connected to and intrigued by. And so it tells me something about the author's connection to the rapier. And not only that, but to possibly have learned the rapier and dagger style of fighting, or at the very minimum, to have admired it as such a skillful practice and way of combat that can even outdo, and we've seen this in several movies over the years as well, that, the rapier and dagger could outdo a much larger man carrying a broadsword, because of its precision and its eloquence and elegance in its movement. And, some big giant guy, even a Scottish with a big giant claymore, could get, poked to death, literally staccato, right? Which is the idea there is that it's, fast thrusts, quick, fast thrusts upon your opponent that they cannot defend. And so that's a great visual, I think. And then when you talk about Benvolio, as a dramatist and a producer and director of the theater, we always look for, and I think probably literary experts and literature majors too, we look for the storyteller character in every novel, in every play. And I think that if you had to name one in Romeo and Juliet, you could be torn between two. The story could be being told. I mean, I get that there's the chorus, but let's set that aside for a moment. And you could be argued that the story is being told by Friar Lawrence, or that the story is being told by Benvolio, almost a la Horatio, like in Hamlet's type of, here's Romeo's cousin who loves him well, as you can tell, the benevolent Benvolio, who is with us from the beginning. Was that not Romeo I saw? And then at the end too, he's one of the few people who actually survives all of this at the end, who is one of the young men,
Yeah. It's, I'm not involved in the theater world, but I can imagine how how rich actually creating these characters on stage, that experience must be, because the stories they're complex stories and complex characters. But yeah, just to come back to the Stoccata and your mention of the interest of the author in fencing. In Quarto 2, that additional fencing terms are added, and Mercutio's kind of throwing them out in a kind of almost in a show-off way, and it's kind of just before his doom. So it kind of suggested to me, and I don't know, maybe this is incorrect, that Shakespeare was kind of emphasizing Mercutio's rashness and boldness by using these terms at that point.
One might even say his vainglorious nature.
Yeah, that's right. About the time that the quartos have been written, there's an Italian fencing manual which is translated into English. I can't recall the term now, but that was available. But certainly the author's got to have an interest in this form of combat to be throwing these terms in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe it'd be interesting to talk about some of the the broader context of how why Shakespeare, is Shakespeare an odd man out in having this interest in Italy, or is this something deeper going on? Would it be worth exploring that?
Do we see, and you might know the answer to this because of the work that you've been doing, do we see other contemporary writers of the time in, let's say, late 16th century, let's say between 1580 and 1600, in that 20-year span? And that's being limiting, but I'm doing that on purpose. But do we see in that 2 decades of English literature other famous writers or playwrights drawing from Bandello the way that Shakespeare does?
Yeah, it's very widespread. I can't speak to that precise time frame, but certainly in that, the Elizabethan Renaissance era. I've got a quote here from a guy, Roderick Marshall, who writes a book on Italy and English literature. So what he says is, never in the history of English drama have so many plays been laid in Italy as in Elizabethan and Jacobean times. Hardly a dramatist of note, but was preoccupied with Italian psychology. For the Italian, it seemed, was a compound of the most signal virtues and vices. Some 500 extant plays, so, it's huge, of this period lean towards Italy, many of them being actually laid there. The dramatists who seem to have specialised in Italian characters include Shakespeare, Johnson, Marston, Tourneur. So, Shakespeare is part of a whole movement, kind of cultural movement within England, which is responding to Italian literature and culture. And, I think it's worth also noting that this interest has to be, to my mind, connected with the English court, because it's through the courts, people were travelling from the English court to the Italian courts, and there were many, multiple at that time, and coming back, and vice versa. And it was through those, aristocratic connections that, this cultural transfer was happening or was being initiated.
Well, so another thing I've been thinking about listening to you talk about some of these connections is, are we looking sometimes perhaps at a reverse engineering? So jumping back for just a moment to the Arthur Brooke translation, for instance, if Brooke says that he saw a Romeo and Juliet performed, and then he decides that he's going to translate the French to English, and as you mentioned, you said, well, and Shakespeare didn't use all of what Brooke included because it's not as good. Are we maybe looking at this through the reverse lens? Maybe Brooke was inspired by Shakespeare's original Quarto 1, maybe a draft that even predates Quarto 1. Maybe Brooke was inspired by seeing the Shakespeare play to translate from French to English, and then added all of these flourishes and these additions that didn't exist in the Shakespeare play, as opposed to the other way around. I suppose it all has to do with where you date the original draft, the very first, let's call it, workshop presentation of this play, because that's in the theater world. We do that. We do like workshop presentations and then test audiences, and the script keeps changing. So, Brooke was fortunate maybe enough to see a very early version of the Shakespeare play, which inspired him to translate from French to English. And he's the first translator into English based on that. And then that tells us that whoever wrote the Shakespeare play absolutely took it from the original Italian and French versions.
It's you're always working with a limited set of data when you're trying to reach these conclusions. But I think, there's a lot of evidence, and here, it's not really my field, but I'm, drawing on the work of people like Catherine Chilgan and others. There's so much evidence of early versions of plays that, perhaps written by Shakespeare and later appear as Shakespeare plays. Of course, the date of printing is, has no necessary connection with the first writing of that particular work. It just sets the latest possible time at which it could have appeared. But yeah, the staging of a play in 1562 is on a Romeo and Juliet play is very suggestive. The story was certainly in England, and whoever wrote that play would certainly have been drawing on the Italian and French versions, because there aren't any English versions known at that point.
And then the other question I would have for you is, because you mentioned you read that quote about how many plays of the time were set in Italy or based in Italian works. And you mentioned Shakespeare being one of the most prevalent there. In fact, I think it's 13 plays out of the 37 best recognized works.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
That's a pretty hefty percentage. I don't know the exact math there because I'm not a math guy, but it's around 42%, I'd say, somewhere in there, of the plays. And that's a hefty percentage of plays set in Italy. Is it possible that these other writers were inspired by Shakespeare's Italian plays to also then set plays in Italy, as opposed to the other way around? Again, this reverse engineering of, well, Shakespeare jumped on an existing bandwagon of everyone being interested in Italian works and Italian plays. Is it possible that the writer known as Shakespeare was the inspiration for the trend? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really, I haven't, for me, both the Italian literature and the English literature, I kind of explore as I go. So, I'm trying to get a handle on Romeo and Juliet and really understand what's happening there, and then, move further and, tackle Othello. But yeah, so, I don't have a full picture of what was going on. I think it's, like maybe this question is kind of related to how we think about a writer like Shakespeare, this kind of mythic figure that, we want to create as part of our national literature. This happens in Italy, it happens in England, I'm sure it happens in other places. And I just want to mention Elizabeth Winkler's book, which I think is a fantastic book. And I want to shout out to my friend David Curry, who's been on this journey with me and who lent me the book. Fantastic book. And I know you've interviewed Elizabeth on the show. I think, some of her insights about how we want a character who is like a demigod, in which we invest everything, is such a powerful idea, but it's not necessarily what was going on. I think one of the conclusions you can draw from the fact that Shakespeare essentially copied from a previous work and he did this for all his plays, right? He took existing stories. There's more than just one individual involved, right from that get-go. So, we have this more complex vision of maybe people working together rather than just one single person who's responsible for the entire gem that is the final product, or, the Shakespearean product.
Well, I think that's very interesting, because I know you approached this because we had some offline conversations leading up to this episode, and securing the time and the date and having just emails back and forth. And so I know that your approach to this was not as an Oxfordian. I'm thrilled and flattered that you are a member of the Quiller Nation and you listen to the podcast, but I know that wasn't your focus, and that's not your direction on this. And if anything, I'm guessing, and I want that the next line of questions, this is what I'm leading to, is the next line of questions for you is, what inspired you to dive into Bandello and this idea of translating these Renaissance Italian works into modern English versions for us to read? I'm going to assume, and not to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to assume part of it is because of your Italian heritage. I'm also Italian. I'm only half Italian on my mother's side, but I have an affinity for all things Italian because growing up Italian, and I'm going to assume that that's part of it, but that's where I was going with is, what inspired you truly to dive into this, and how much of it along the way did you discover connected to your interest? At the very minimum, you have an interest in the Shakespeare authorship mystery, or you wouldn't listen to this podcast. So can you share with us some of that, if you can?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the Italian background. We haven't really explored that. So, my parents were migrants to Australia. They brought our family here when I was 2. I was born in Italy in a place called San Severo, which is in Apulia. And, so I grew up in a place called Queanbeyan, which is right next to Australia's capital, Canberra. A lot of Italian migrants were arriving in that era. And so, in a sense, I was growing up in two worlds. At home, we were speaking Italian, and we'd eat pasta. We'd visit our Italian relatives in Italy. Make tomato sauce, all the usual things. But then, I'd hang out with my Aussie friends. I read sci-fi. We played D&D. I was a complete Tolkien nerd. So, these two worlds were kind of both in my life. And I didn't really kind of take an interest intellectually in Italy until much later in life. And, as I've gotten on in years, I've felt that I really needed to better understand what Italy means, what that experience means. So to come back to this, why I'm drawn to this connection between Shakespeare and Italy and these Italian writers, at a kind of really, personal sense, in a sense, it's connecting those two worlds that are part of my life. They're connecting them together. And I'm kind of seeing, the Italian threads coming through the English literature that I studied in school. Like, we did some Shakespeare in school. So, yeah, that was kind of what drew me in. On the authorship question, I'm, as you know, what I'm really hoping this work that I'm doing will achieve is make these Italian stories known. And I think that's the most important contribution that I can make. But as a kind of researcher working on this, I came across the authorship question, and I felt it was not something I could ignore. I feel that it's important that when legitimate questions are raised, in a scholarly context, that we try and think them through and work out, how we might answer them. So, I think the questions that are raised in the authorship debate are entirely legitimate questions. I also have a computer science background, I ended up doing a PhD in computer science, but it didn't go anywhere in the end. But the reason I mention that is because I was attracted to the work that Dennis McCarthy has done on Sir Thomas North, just by the sheer volume of the material he's able to show literary parallels. But how I use this material is kind of as a research lens, because I want to understand the world, what we make of these works if we look from a traditional viewpoint, but also if we switch lenses and, think about it from an alternative authorship point of view, what do we learn? And I think, the authorship debate is at its best when it's asking questions. And it's really, even it's evident on your show that it's producing novel research that wouldn't otherwise be, that we wouldn't have. And it's very valuable. And it's not just it doesn't stop at the question of who may have written the plays. It extends to the question of how were they written? Why were they written? And you start to get a much richer appreciation of the Elizabethan world. So I think it makes an important contribution from those points of view. I want to mention Elizabeth Winkler's book again, and I know she mentions this kind of idea of the scientific revolution, and she talks about Thomas Kuhn and how what's happened in this debate looks a lot like what Thomas Kuhn describes. It was that idea was something that struck me as well. And if you go further, there's another researcher, a guy called Imre Lakatos, philosopher of science, but the ideas work in this context. And he talks about, why does one set of research, he calls them research program, or succeed and another doesn't? What makes science good, in other words? And one of the key things he observes is that, if it's producing results, then it's going to succeed. So I think, for people who are, for whom the authorship debate is the thing, I think, keep doing what you're doing, because it's making a really wonderful contribution.
Well, I just want to make sure all of the listeners know I did not pay him to say, keep asking questions. I promise. But that's basically what Michael just said, which is we need to all keep asking questions. And I, obviously can't possibly agree more, because that's the theme of this program. And it's always been the theme of this program. And I love to hear you say that, not just because it validates the theme of this series, but because I believe it is the secret to the answer. And one of the things I think you mentioned that is becoming more and more prevalently true, which is the work of McCarthy and Blanding as well, Michael Blanding, who wrote the book based on McCarthy's research, is that Thomas North is involved somehow. And there are certain people out there who want to just dismiss the whole North connection because it doesn't suit their narrative, or it's not something that they had invested in, or their research now needs to all be rethought in a different way. And I think that that's so short-sighted, because what happens again and again in this mystery is that more and more we keep finding characters in the play, as it were. There are characters who continue to be recognized in this drama, this mysterious drama as it unfolds, that all share a lot of things in common, which is that they belong in the aristocratic inner circle. And no one has ever been able to explain to me in any way whatsoever that makes any sense at all how the man from Stratford fits into this group of concentric circles of power that are connected to this mystery. And that's the one thing I think that we need to keep pushing more interest in, is figuring out how all of these characters played a role in this drama, and including how did the Stratford man play a role in the drama, if at all. But the bottom line is he's the big thing that doesn't belong here. It's almost like a Mr. Rogers episode. One of these things doesn't belong here. And it's that guy.
Yeah, I think the connection with the court is absolutely central. That's kind of coherent with the Italian connections. So yeah, either directly or indirectly, whoever wrote the plays has to get it. There's a pretty high probability it's coming from that source. So even if it's whether it's direct or indirect, the courts are where this stuff first happens. I think some of your visitors have talked about the plays being staged privately for Queen Elizabeth. That model of how things were happening. So yeah, I think, but perhaps to return to the story, I wanted to read out just a little passage from my translation of Romeo and Juliet. It's another little clue about, and this one shows us how Shakespeare worked, the author worked. So yeah, it's quite nice if I can share that.
Absolutely. That's excellent. I love this. Yeah, let's hear it.
So this is, Juliet's kind of being told she has to marry Paris. She's desperate. She works out the deal with the friar, with Friar Lawrence, to take the potion. So she's about to do it. So the days on which the nuptials were to take place was fixed, and Juliet was sumptuously arrayed in a splendid dress and precious gems. She showed herself willing and laughed and jested. Yet each hour until the time fixed to drink the potion seemed to her 1,000 years. The night came before the Sunday on which she was to be publicly wed. She, as young as she was, without a word to any, prepared a glass of water, and making sure that her nurse did not see her, put it by her bed. Little, if any, sleep did she get that night. Warring thoughts tormented her soul. As the hour of the dawn approached when she should drink the potion, Tybalt appeared to her imagination, as she had seen him, with the blood-dripping wound cut deep in his throat. Recalling that she would be laid beside, if not upon him, and that within that tomb there were other corpses and many naked bones, she felt a chill within her body, and the hairs of her body stood on end. Fear so oppressed her that she trembled as a leaf in the wind. An icy sweat spread over all her limbs, and it seemed to her that those corpses were little by little tearing her body in 1,000 pieces. For a time, fear so gripped her that she did not know what she would do. Then, having somewhat recovered courage, she said to herself, "Oh my, what am I doing? Where will I allow myself to be taken? If by chance I wake before the friar and Romeo come, what shall become of me? Would I be able to suffer the foulness that issues from Tybalt's rotting corpse, when in my home I can hardly stand any stench, no matter how slight it be? Who knows if not some serpent or 1,000 worms are found in that sepulchre, which I fear so greatly and which so disgust me? And as my heart does not have the courage to look on them, how can I bear to have them all around and touching me? Have I not also heard it many times said that many fearful things have befallen of a night, not just in tombs, but in churches and cemeteries too? With these fearful thoughts and imagining 1,000 abominable things, she had almost resolved not to take the powder and came near to pouring it on the ground. And so she was lost in strange, confused conceits, some urging her to take the draught, and others bringing 1,000 dangerous things to mind. Despite the fantasies that had tormented her during the night, as the dawn began to lift its head above the balustrades of the Orient, impelled by her fervent love for Romeo that dominated her soul, and having banished her fearful thoughts, in one fierce gulp, she drank down the potion. She lay back down, and in but a moment was asleep. So yeah, I really love that passage because it has so much of Juliet's character. She's she's this really feisty character, and in Bandello's version, she's even more she's even more a leader. She's really the person in charge. But in that passage where in Bandello's version, she's alone in her bed, and she then takes the potion. That idea, well, actually, sorry, I'm getting it wrong. In the Bandello version, her nurse is sleeping next to her in the bed, whereas in Shakespeare, the previous translators have changed that plot point and they've made everyone leave her bedroom. But then Shakespeare reconsiders that. He says, and he writes, and he puts some words, Shakespeare puts some words in Juliet's mouth. Juliet thinks about asking the nurse to come back, and then she says, "Nurse, what should she do here? My dismal scene, I needs must act alone." This is another little kind of suggestive clue that Shakespeare read Bandello, but it's also a beautiful insight into how the dramatist worked. He's working with these ideas, and then, he's thinking, should I bring back the other characters? Then he's inspired to say, my dismal scene, I needs must act alone. And it's just, magic.
A novelist has the luxury of characters having internal dialogue without speaking that dialogue out loud. So here, Juliet, and being very, very familiar with this play and having produced and directed it multiple times, I can tell you here, Juliet, this soliloquy that she delivers, which is a very powerful, powerful soliloquy where she sees the image of Tybalt. She describes all that you just said, your English translation of Bandello's Italian, and it shows us how much that inspired the scene in the play. But as a dramatist, you can't have a character miming for 3 minutes. You have to hear the internal monologue. You have to hear the soliloquy. Exactly, and it would be weird to have the nurse sleeping there next to her while she delivers this very emotional, very impassioned soliloquy. So instead what he does is he gives the homage to Bandello, to the nurse having been there in the original sleeping while she would have been thinking these thoughts in her mind without uttering a word. And it's a wonderful depiction of the source material lending itself to the dramatist making dramatic decisions, but staying as true as possible to the original source. That's what I hear when you read what you just read.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, some of the best soliloquies ever written are put into the mouth of that character. She has 3 magnificent moments on stage where technically she is alone. I mean, when she does the balcony speech, Romeo's there and he's listening, obviously, but there's that moment. Then there's the moment while she's waiting for him to come after they've been married, and she's waiting for him to come and spend the night with her. That's a magnificent piece. And then, of course, the piece that you just described there, where she's contemplating whether she should drink it. And one of the things I love that Shakespeare adds in is that she has this moment of doubt of the priest himself. Is this really poison? Is he just trying to kill me and get me out of the way to exonerate his own guilt and having secretly married me to Romeo? And I love that moment as well, because you're like, ooh, we all know the end, but if we didn't know the end, wow, I'll talk about a potential plot twist, right?
Yeah. And, different versions of this story have a darker or a more benevolent Friar Lawrence character. So it's, I think the Porto was, has a darker Friar Lorenzo than the one that Bandello did. But these speeches, and there are a lot of speeches in the Bandello version too. Some, like this one that I just read, almost make it, in large measure into Shakespeare. Others are just completely lost. So there's a beautiful speech by Romeo where he's just learned that he believes that Juliet is dead. She's taken the potion. And he's just learned that. And then in Bandello, there's this beautiful speech by Romeo, really about his guilt. He feels he's failed in saving Juliet from her fate. He's been hanging out in Mantua and not doing what he should have been doing. And he almost tries to take his life at that point and is prevented by his servant. And that's one that didn't make it into Shakespeare, although elements of it perhaps moved to an earlier scene when Friar Lawrence prevents Romeo from taking his life when he's exiled. So, yeah, one of the delights of reading these two versions together is you see how the playwright has reworked this material to make it, work better on stage. One of the differences is Bandello's a prose writer. Shakespeare is, he's both poet and prose writer. So moments of intense emotion or distress in the storyline can show up as poetry in Shakespeare, like what's in a what's in a name. That entire speech comes from Juliet's anguish, which is directly described in Bandello, about discovering that Romeo is the son of her family's enemies.
Well, and the scene you speak about where Friar Lawrence, chides Romeo for his reaction to being banished. And it's such a magnificent scene because he says to him, you could be dead. You could have been sentenced to death, but you are not. You're sentenced to banishment. And that means you get to live to fight another day. Are you a man? I think he says, thy tears are womanish. I think he says in the scene. And, but he does stop Juliet from doing violent hands upon herself, which is, a foreshadow for later when she has no choice. Right. But it's a magnificent, I mean, there's a reason why this particular play of them all has stood out throughout history and continues to resonate with audiences over and over again through the centuries. But I think that one of the things we find here, Michael, through your work is that Bandello is as much a humanist as our writer Shakespeare. And that's why our writer Shakespeare was so inspired by the works of Bandello, because what you just read, the English translation of the original Italian, maybe it's because we all have visions of performances of Romeo and Juliet in our head and can see it in our minds when we hear you speak those words. But I have to say that, that's the fine capturing of the human condition going on there. And so these men are kindred spirits, I would say.
Absolutely. They're both trying to, they don't shy away from human behavior. And even sometimes even more so in Bandello, he's telling a direct story and, he's able to share with us what people are thinking because of the narrative form. So we get all that. So one of the intense aspects of his version of the story is the sheer anguish of Romeo and Juliet. They've got serious mental health issues, and that's really at the heart of the story. Both Romeo, he starts with he's lovesick after Rosaline, and he's really obsessive. But Juliet also falls into these deep despair, as the story unfolds. And all the, people around them are trying to help them. So you've got this story about two young people suffering, mental torment. And, part of the tragedy is that their society is completely unable to help them. And, in fact, they do things which lead to their death or their deaths. And that comes through more strongly in Bandello, although it's there in Shakespeare as well.
There's almost this curse of overprivilege that the two of them suffer from when you think about it in terms of today's descriptions. You know, we're talking about first world problems that these two very spoiled young people are dealing with. But there is, no matter what the circumstance, what I think one of the reasons why it resonates with us is the pressures, regardless of where they come from, are real pressures. The pressure to be the model child, the pressure to uphold the family name, the pressure to do as you are instructed and to represent the honor and dignity of your family, the pressure of holding the same enemies as your families hold. You know, one of the things that I'm curious about, because I don't know the Bandello story, is the Scalas, because, you know, Aeschylus in the play is obviously based on the Scalas who were ruling Verona at the time the play is set. And does Bandello is there a Prince of Verona involved in Bandello's original story?
Yes,
is it the Scala
so it's
dynasty there at that time? Explain a little bit of that if you could.
Sure. So, you know, historically, there is this family, the Scala family, and they're quite a famous family, not just historically, but in literature. Dante Alighieri was, you know, he fled to Verona, and the Bartolomeo, I think it was Bartolome della Scala. I might have, no, actually, it was he had a nickname, Can Grande della Scala, which means big dog della Scala. So he was kind of a tough guy, presumably. He was Dante's patron. And I think it's that character.
I just recently stood beneath the tomb. That there's that wonderful spot in Verona with the 4 Scala tombs all in that one corner, just on the other side of the plaza. Beautiful. And then there's that fabulous statue of Dante Alighieri right there in the plaza. I just recently was there just a couple of months ago. So I totally get where you're going here.
Yeah. And it's that character, which is the prince in Bandello. He actually gives us the name of the prince. I'll just check because memory fails me. I'll just see if I can quickly find it.
Well, while you're looking for that, so the next thing I wanted to ask you about is you have named this book, and I want to make sure that we tell the listeners, because by now their whistles are definitely wet. And if you're not craving a copy of this book, folks, I'm not sure what's wrong with you, because especially that passage that he just read, to think about reading this new English interpretation of the original Italian with the knowledge that you already have of this story, you're definitely going to want to get a copy. And one of the things that Michael has done with this is he has named it to basically make it the first part of a series of books that he's going to produce. And I don't want to speak for him, but he's going to be doing some of the other plays he mentioned as part of this Shakespeare's Origins in Italy. Did I name that right, Michael? Help me out here and let the listeners know how to get them.
Yeah, so the book's titled Romeo and Juliet, a New English Translation by Michael Cotati. So, and the author is Matteo Bandello, and the series is Shakespeare Begins. So, it's kind of, I think it's not the whole story, but, these Italian contributions to Shakespeare are part of what eventually manifests on the English stage. That's the name of the book.
Is there a website? Is there a special website you want them to go to, or is it best for them to just try to find it on Amazon? What's the best way to get a copy of the book?
Just on Amazon would be the quickest way to get it. So, yeah. But I have a website as well where I write generally about Italy, and I can share that after the interview, and perhaps you can share it with the listeners.
Well, go ahead. Tell us right now. What is it?
Oh, okay. So I have a website where I write. It's called Beyond Foreignness. Which is kind of a thematic theme I keep coming back to. And I've been writing on that site for 10 years now or more. But you'll find all my Italian articles there, articles about literature, culture, history, and about Shakespeare. I've just released another article, What Italian Novellas Really Taught Me About Shakespeare, which is kind of just thinking about that question of, what have I learned through this process?
Well, and I think our listeners would love to visit that site because I think they're going to be just as interested in your writings about this process as they will be interested in the copies of the translations. And if you're searching, Michael, so everyone knows, the spelling is Curtotti. That's Curtotti, Curtotti. That will help you find him. And if you just type Michael Curtotti into Amazon, then boom, that's going to help you. But again, his website, tell us the website again, Michael.
So it's called Beyond Foreignness, spelt with 2 N's. So it's
Beyond Foreignness?
Yes, Beyond Foreignness. And it's just beyondforeignness.org.
Beyondforeignness.org. And you can find his commentary on the work that he's been doing and some of the revelations he has discovered throughout that process. Did you find the passage you were looking for?
Yes, so it was Bartolomeo della Scala, who's Can Grande della Scala. So, as far as we know, Romeo and Juliet didn't really exist in history, but the Capulets and Montagues did, apparently. So, the Verona version of the story is the one that's come down to us.
Well, it's fantastic. And like I said, having just recently been there and standing in the square, and in the play, Aeschylus comes out and he says, three times have you disturbed our public streets? And you realize it's right there in that square that he's talking about, which is literally 3 buildings away from the county seat, the prince's quarters, where he would have been, which means that he would have heard the commotion in the streets, which is why he comes down with his guards and can get there so quickly in the middle of the fray. It's because he can hear it from his office. Basically, he's like up in his office doing Prince stuff, and he hears this commotion not too far. It's only a couple of buildings away, through a passage, through a hall, and boom, you're there in this open square, and you could see him coming out and going, enough of this. You two have got to stop this because it's disturbing the peace, and it's my job to keep the peace. Is that a part of the Bandello story as well?
It is. I'm not remembering precisely how it falls out in the Bandello version. Shakespeare introduces at the beginning, and this is one of, another sort of amazing way he dramatizes the story. He brings the conflict right to the front of the story, and that doesn't happen in Bandello. So there's this initial conflict between Gregory and Samson, and there's a fight, and the prince comes down. So I think it's a little bit different in Bandello, but definitely the prince gets involved when, after the Tybalt gets killed. The prince is, central at the end. He wants to know what has gone on with these 2 lovers, why are they both dead? And with Bandello also you get nice insights into where things happened. So he actually names the street where Tybalt was killed. You just basically in front of the old castle. You might have visited, where the Roman gate is inside the city. It's called Porter's Gate.
Yes.
And a little bit further down, you come to the old castle by the bank of the river. And it's just in that area that Tybalt and Romeo have their final conflict. San Francesco, the church, is mentioned in Bandello's version. So it's, and then that's where Romeo and Juliet get married, where they go to seek help from Friar Lawrence. So yeah, there's this. If you are visiting Verona, read the Bandello version, because it will be a great. And you want to kind of explore what was going on with the story. It gives you these little gems.
Those old Roman walls and battlements are quite a sight to see as you walk through the park there at the, I want to say it's the west side of the city gates, the old city gates, the Porto you're talking about. And one of the things that I thought was interesting too, is you walk through there past the sycamore grove, which Shakespeare mentions. As you walk through there, the first set of buildings on your right-hand side is basically the armory. It is the military seat. And today it is still used as a seat of law enforcement power in the city. Those buildings have not changed. It's really incredible after hundreds of years that these buildings are still there being used for those purposes that they were first designed that near the gate, which makes sense. You want your army right inside the gate. So if you need them, they can go to their posts and if anyone breaches, there's a barracks right there, so it's really incredible the amount of history that's there. And the way that this author, Shakespeare, is inspired by Bandello, finds him to be this kindred spirit, not just in this play, but in the other plays that we've talked about that you're now going to be working on, which I can't wait to see. It's really incredible that they have this connection and that we'll always have this, I call the Italian connection to the works of the greatest English author of all time. And I think that it's unmistakable and undeniable and needs to further be explored and addressed the way that you are helping to do so. Along those lines, one of the big questions I have, and tracing back to now the beginning of the episode, with regards to the understanding of foreign languages and the understanding of Shakespeare and his ability to pull from foreign works, when you're translating something from Italian to English, how often do you find that there are words that just aren't the same, that don't translate, or that you have a choice of 4 or 5 English words and you have to now make the decision which one is the best suited to continue the story and be as honest and true to the story? What's that process like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I wanted with this Bandello translation to try and capture his voice, which is, of course, something really difficult because you're using, different words. But I wanted to capture that beautiful narrative style that Bandello has. What surprised me, or as I was working on this, is I had this kind of sense of familiarity as an English, like it was this weird sense of, as an English speaker, reading the Italian and thinking, oh, gee, that's so familiar to me as an English speaker. And it's, I think, I don't know how well-grounded this is, but, what the thought that came to me was that this Elizabethan period when, as we've seen, England was so oriented to what was going on in Italy, was formative in the English language. In fact, there's this guy called John Florio, who is an Anglo-Italian in London, and in the Shakespearean era, he's sometimes mentioned as a possible editor of the first folio. He produces the first substantial English-Italian dictionary, and there's evidence. I think I was just reading a paper that someone was saying, Shakespeare drew on that dictionary. But he was the third most prolific contributor of words to the English language, after Shakespeare and Chaucer. So there's this really profound connection there. And, and that helped with trying to represent the words in English. But of course, you have to make choices. Every word has an envelope of meaning, and some phrasing is not going to work across languages. But maybe just to explore this connection with Italy a little bit more, I was thinking about, well, if we think about, the Shakespeare works as a whole, where do we find the kind of Italian-related content? So we've talked about, the plays, some of the plays, Twelfth Night, Measure for Measure, Othello, Cymbeline, Romeo, Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing. But even a play like there's Edward III, I think also has a Bandello story version. There's other Italian writers, Cinzio, he's the guy who wrote Othello or the Othello story. But, if we think about the sonnets, they're inspired, England creates its own form of them, but they're inspired by Petrarchan sonnets, which, go back through Italian history to Sicily, to the court of Frederick II. The comic characters that Shakespeare uses, they come from the Commedia dell'arte tradition, which I think you've talked about, these stock characters who performed in masks, and they were adapted to characters like Samson and Gregory, which, enliven the Shakespeare works. If you want to include ancient plays, you've got the Roman plays as well. Titus Andronicus, the primary narrative is that it's based on Seneca, but in fact, one researcher notes that they're not so much Roman Senecan models as Italian Senecan models. So Titus Andronicus is inspired by some of the drama that Cinzio, the guy who was working on Othello, was creating in the court in Ferrara. So there's all these connections. The theme of gender equality. So we see the nature of the Juliet character in the Measure for Measure story, which also comes from Italy. We have women advocating for justice before the emperor. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same in the Shakespeare version. Violence against women in the Othello story, which Shakespeare embodies as well. In the Italian Renaissance, you had female writers like Laura Terracina. She writes this poem which starts with the words, "Oh, you who are enemy to woman," and it has a verse like this: "O enemy of heaven and of nature, with what boldness you raise your hand against so young and beautiful a vision. Where comes this, your so perverse desire?" So this kind of gender issues that we see in Shakespeare. So, there's so many connections going on there. And of course, Shakespeare is his own, there's so much that is original and wonderful in the Shakespeare plays and sonnets and so forth. But if you took out all those elements, we wouldn't be able to recognize Shakespeare. It would be a different thing.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's astounding to me that I can look at all of this evidence that you're talking about and all of these connections, especially these connections to Italy. And, there are some Italian scholars who have claimed that Shakespeare was Italian. Like they want to own him as their own because they see so much of the culture of Italy within the works of Shakespeare. They're not the only ones. The Germans tried to claim him as one of theirs too, but for an entirely different reason. But I think that what we find, the beauty of what we find, is that he belongs to all of us and he belongs to every culture. And I think that when you look at the connection to the works of Bandello, you see that, Bandello also is one of those same humanists who belongs to all of us, who belongs to every culture. And I think it's incredible that you have this new English translation of this magnificent novella. I can't wait to see your future works on the other works of Bandello. I still am curious about when you find a place where there is a word in Italian that there isn't an English equivalent for, what your process is for determining which English word or collection of words you're going to use. I love what you said earlier about every word has an envelope of meaning. What a magnificent quote. And it tells me that, yes, you are a writer and you are one of those same kindred spirits, because what a magnificent simile to use there. It's like an envelope of meaning is incredible.
Yeah, I wish I could claim that one, but I wish I could claim it. It's not mine.
You didn't coin that phrase. Well, good for you for being honest, because it's a brilliant one. Whoever said it is brilliant. And from a translator's point of view, it makes so much sense. So do you find yourself going to your wife as your muse and saying, I have this word or this word or this word, which one should I choose? Or do you have some other mentor in your life who you go to? Or is there a process that you go by in eliminating words and finally go, okay, this one is the closest English word that matches? How does that work? That's what I'm trying to kind of dive into your brain to understand.
Yeah. It's kind of a really, it's hard to capture, because you have and it's no merit of mine. My parents taught me Italian when I was growing up. They insisted that we speak in Italian to them. So, I had enough of the language to build on. But, you have these two vocabularies almost, and you're trying to match them up in your mind. And, for me, beyond the meaning or the surface meaning of the words for working on Bandello, it was really, what was the feeling I was getting from Bandello? That was really important to me. He's a very, he's kind of an emotive writer. And I think sometimes, it's hard to convey that in English without going over the top. It doesn't work quite the same in English. But yeah, I thought it was really important to convey the deep emotions that the words that Bandello uses convey. But yeah, it's it's word by word, phrase by phrase. You kind of look at it. In working on this, I went over it many times because I was never happy with whether I'd captured it adequately. So, 5 or 6 times reworking the translation to try to get it to a good place. A wonderful, interesting English version for me, and made a bunch of great suggestions on improving the English flow.
Well, I think that part is fascinating. And, another thing you said earlier about when you talked about Florio, and you said he was the 3rd largest contributor to new English words, neologism, as it were. But you said Shakespeare, Chaucer, Florio. So Shakespeare obviously is the crown prince of neologism when it comes to words in the English language. And I wonder how many of those words are based in Italian words and in places where he himself found there wasn't an English equivalent, and he sort of made one up. He has so many characters who create words to express themselves. And something I tell actors when I'm directing a play, I said, when you find a word and you're not certain about the origin of that word, or you're not certain what that word actually means, and you Google that word, and what you find is that its very first appearance in print is in the play that we're playing, that we're doing, then you have to remind yourself that your character is so moved by the moment they are in, while they are trying to describe what they're feeling, what they saw, what they're thinking, what their motivation is, the crux of the argument they're making to the other characters on the stage, or in some cases in a soliloquy or a monologue to the audience or to themselves. When they speak a word that is brand new for the very first time, think about how important it is in the mind of that character when they speak that word. Think about in your common day life, how often do you make up a word in conversation to share what you're feeling? I don't. I can't believe I do very often if I do. But here we have these characters in this canon who regularly make up new words to express how they feel or to express what's happening in the scene. And so I always tell actors, that's a momentous moment. Like, that's a huge moment in the life of your character who suddenly couldn't find a better way to express themselves, but to create a brand new word in the language to do so. And that's the power of this writer and his ability and what he does. And it's one of the reasons why I say that it bespeaks a man who was fluent in multiple languages and sometimes combined those languages together to create new speak for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not something I particularly sort of looked into, but many of those new words will, have been adopted into English from Italian and other languages. So I think one of the wonderful elements of the success of the literature, English literature of this period, was that it was so outward looking, so willing to take, from abroad and look at, and then make it, into something new. And this has given us this wonderful literature from the Shakespearean period.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time all the way from your home in Australia to share all of this with us, Michael. It's been a magnificent visit. I appreciate you reaching out to me with this new work and the ability to now share it with the listeners. Remember, Quiller Nation, it is Michael Curtotti, Curtotti. You can find his works on his website, and you can also find his book on Amazon. And the more copies of this that you buy, the more it will inspire him to write the rest of them and translate the rest of them. And maybe, Michael, somewhere down the road, you do like a compendium of the very specific references and moments that you found through this translation that connect to Shakespeare, because I think that's a whole nother book that needs to be written.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't help being fascinated by this connection. And it's been such a delight to talk with you today. I want to thank you for inviting me. This is such a beautiful question. Thinking about these plays and what they mean to us about the writer and the world they came from, it's just very special. And in this context, the connection with Italy, which is, something very close to my heart. So, thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope to share more as I continue working on these projects.
Well, you definitely have to keep us informed. And then one thing, not to put you on the spot, and you can say no if the answer is no, but do you happen to have near you, in front of you, close at hand, any of the original Italian Bandello? And could you maybe just read us a passage in Italian?
Sure. It'll just take me a sec, but yeah.
Well, my wife and I, when we were in Rome, we went and saw Shakespeare in the Park in Rome. And we saw Othello. We saw Shakespeare in the Park when we were in Rome, and we saw Othello. And it was all in Italian. It was the first time I had seen a Shakespeare production live in a foreign language. I'd seen some videos of foreign language productions of Shakespeare. It was the first time witnessing it live, and we happened to have the best possible seats. We were front row center. And it was so magnificent. The actors were so expressive, and it was so beautiful. And the language is so beautiful to listen to. And you know the play well enough that it doesn't matter that you're hearing it in a foreign language. And it was so brilliant and so magnificent. We leapt to our feet at the end, and we were weeping for the last 15 minutes of the play, and wept for another 10 minutes after it was over. It was just such a moving and magnificent performance. So that's why I'm like, well, if I have somebody who is an Italian speaker who loves this work as much as you do, and you have some original Bandello in front of you, I'm not going to let you go without just giving us a little taste of that.
Absolutely, and absolute pleasure to share something. So I'm just going to read from the moment when Romeo meets Juliet. It's quite different in the Bandello version, but very, very beautiful in its own way. So Romeo's at the ball and he's, drinking in the beauty of the ladies at the ball, as Bandello says. Quivi era divenuto Romeo, consideratore delle bellezze delle donne che erano sulla feste, e questa e quella più o meno secondo l'appetito comandava, e senza danzare s'andava in cotal maniera diportando, quando gli viene veduta una fuor di misura bellissima garzona che egli non conosceva. Questa infinitamente gli piacque e giudicò che la più bella e aggraziata giovane non aveva veduto già mai. Pareva a Romeo quanto più intentamente la mirava, che tanta più le bellezze di quella divenissero belle e che le grazie più grate si facessero. So shall I read the translation as well?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, man, it was so beautiful. Oh, brava.
Yeah,
bella,
it is beautiful writing. Yeah. So Romeo drank in the beauty of the ladies at the ball, and this or that lady more or less would please him. In this manner he entertained himself, without taking to the dance floor. Then a girl of surpassing beauty, whom he did not know, passed before his eyes. The sight of her brought infinite delight, and he thought her the most beautiful and gracious maiden he had ever seen. It seemed to Romeo that the more keenly he gazed upon her, the greater her beauty became, and the more graceful her grace. Yeah, Bandello is just beautiful in his style of writing. So,
well, it's so poetic, isn't it?
So delighted to be able to share that.
Yeah, and it is so poetic that it's not it's no wonder that someone who had the creative impetus that we know the author of Shakespeare had would be inspired by that type of beautiful writing. And, I will say, I don't care what anyone says, I will say that writer was able to read that text in Italian, understand it in Italian, and that's the source of the inspiration. The beauty of Bandello's Italian novella is what inspired the play Romeo and Juliet. That's my belief, and I'm sticking to it.
Absolutely. It has to be. It has to be. It's, Shakespeare wasn't going to pick up second-rate material. This was one of the best stories out there.
And and I don't care however you were exposed to it initially. I mean, let's argue that the first exposure of the story is English or is the French. I think that you're so moved by it that you go seek out the original Italian. You go find it. You go look for it, especially somebody like this writer. So, yeah, I believe that's these are the type of linchpins I think we're looking for. And I'm so glad that you reached out, and I'm so glad we were able to have you as a guest. And I hope those of you folks listening out there feel as inspired as I do to now go grab a copy of Michael's book and to read it. And it does come side by side, right, Michael? The Italian
there's two versions. You can, there's an English only version and a parallel language version. So,
well, I'm going to get me the parallel language version because I should learn some more Italian, being Italian. And it's always been my great regret that I only know a lot of swear words and terms of love, and that's about it. So this is going to also help me become a better Italian speaker as well. So I thank you for this, and I'm going to go to Amazon right now and get my copy.
Wonderful. It's been such a delight speaking with you, Stephen, and I look forward to continuing to listen to the Quilla podcast. It's such a wonderful show you have. And thank you again so much for inviting me.
Well, there you have it, Fellow Quillers, thank you for joining us for another magnificent episode. They just keep getting better. Join us soon. Don't forget, our big anniversary episode is coming in January as we embark upon our 6th season. We're approaching, it'll be the 125th episode, our anniversary episode. So we'll hope you're looking forward to that and an entire new season to come. Michael Cortati is his name. We thank him for joining us. Go get his book. Before we leave you, I just wanted to quickly shout out to those of you who responded to our recent episode featuring John Anthony. Hopefully you are all enjoying his YouTube channel. There are some tremendous videos there that I think will inspire some of you to do some very deep rabbit holing. So I do caution you to be very careful to have some time on your hands before you go visit John's YouTube site. It's an incredible site with a growing number of videos there, and I hope that you can find some wonderful research and some great details that John provides on his channel. A special mention to our listener and Patreon patron, Sandi Boney, who reminds us all that we can be a part of the Oxfordian movement in our own small way that could turn into a very big way. And that is that if you visit your local library and request them to obtain Shakespeare authorship books for their shelves, most libraries will allow you to fill out a request for books, and they have a certain amount of budget that they will go and get those books for patrons of the library. So if you go and you bug your librarian and bug your library staff, be that squeaky wheel to get the grease, encourage them to bring in a few Shakespeare authorship books to start, then keep requesting and build that little section of their Shakespeare area. And maybe perhaps you inspire an entire shelf of Shakespeare authorship books that can then be discovered by others in the future who visit the library and use the library. So it's just one way that you can be a part of the grassroots movement out there and help push that paradigm just a little bit, and without having to go and create your own converts, as it were. Let people discover this on their own and find their own journey. That's been one of my mantras for a long time, is that we all discover this great mystery in a different way, many through this program, and we're grateful for that. But we all go and we all dig into the areas that speak to us most and have our own journey. Some of us, we go down the multiple authorship candidate hole for a while. Some of us, we dive right into Oxford. Some of us still hold on to ideas that Bacon was involved or Marlowe was involved, and we're not sure that that's not true. Rutland even, perhaps Stanley, I believe, was definitely involved as the son-in-law of Oxford. So we all kind of dive into our own version of this mystery and seek the clues and answers that we have our own selves. And I love that about this program and about this series and about what we try to foster here at Don't Quill the Messenger, which is, now that you're hooked on the mystery, deep dive wherever you choose to. And maybe we can help inspire some other super sleuths through getting our libraries to put together an authorship section. I'd like to thank longtime Quiller Dean Bradley, who is another member of our Quillers Down Under, who suggests that we all have a nice laugh at the new BBC biopic series called Rise of a Genius, which he describes as riddled with more of the nonsensical mythology the Stratford claim has always rested upon. It doesn't surprise any of us, I'm sure. And the title itself just tells us everything that we need to know. Rise of a Genius. Like the hand of God just touched this Stratford man out of nowhere, and suddenly the works of Shakespeare sprung from his head like Athena from the skull of Zeus. I used that metaphor on purpose. Yes, I did. I'd also like to direct you all to find past guest and fellow Quiller Philip Cooper's new essay at his website regarding the famous tower painting of Henry Roseley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. It is a very intriguing read. We may need to invite Philip back to the program to help better explain his findings there, but you can read it for yourselves at his site. Remember, Philip's site is call-me-naive.com. And if you go there, if you haven't visited before, if you go there and you're looking through his various essays that he has there, this one is an analysis of Sonnet 67. It's some fascinating stuff, as usual, from Philip, and we're happy to direct Quillers to go check it out. Again, call-me-naive.com. So check that out. Keep those emails coming, Quiller Nation. As I always say, it may take me some time to respond, but I do receive them, and I do respond when I have time. To learn more about all things Quiller in nature, make sure you join our email subscriber list. You can do that right from the homepage of the website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. And you can also find the link to our Patreon site, where you will learn even more details about the program and all things Quiller in nature. Just click the little red Patreon button from the homepage, and it'll take you right there. A quick shout out to our December Quiller of the Month, Troy Stelzer. Troy, thank you for your continued support, and congratulations on being the final Quiller of the Month for the year 2023. We will look forward to announcing the first Quiller of the Month for the new year at our anniversary episode coming in a fortnight, where we will celebrate the beginning of our 6th season here at Don't Quill the Messenger. As usual, producer Jake and I will be reviewing the past year, sharing some stats with you, let you know what your favorite episodes were of the year, talk about some of our favorite episodes of the year. We will read some of our favorite comments and reviews about the show, including the criticisms. We enjoy those the most. If you'd like to be a part of that, you can send your comments now to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And until we see you in the new year, fellow Quillers, and what an exciting new year it's going to be, with new guests, new episodes, live episodes, new bonus features, and of course, our giant Quiller gathering in Minneapolis in April. Until then, folks, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.